Hi everyone, welcome to another Table Talk. So if you've been following my YouTube channel, I just recently completed my most recent project. I completed the FRC Foamy's FA18 Hornet, which is a tail mount park jet. So meaning essentially the motor is back here in the tail as opposed to being mid-mount or prop and slot similar to this little bad boy. So I wanted to, I had a loyal YouTube follower asked me a question a while ago during that project, if I would sort of give my ideas and thoughts on tail mount and mid mount park jets. So that's sort of what I wanted to do today. And you know, most of this obviously is just fact and common sense. It's not really you know, anything that I've come up with. It's just, you know, they're different style, different layouts of airplanes. So you know, there are just certain facts that are going to be true about either build. But I just wanted to, you know, obviously I have a lot more flights with prop and slot park jets. You know, I've only built one. One tail mount, and I will fully admit I did have you know, some paradigms about performance and build and all that sort of stuff about tail mounts that you know, just I got stuck in a rut, I guess, and never built one. There is, you know, a lot. There seems to be a bit more of a trend now amongst some park jet designers going to tail mount park jets, and I'm certainly not going to sit here and tell you which one is my favorite. You know, I think they both have benefits and or advantages and maybe disadvantages. But again, it doesn't. Maybe there are more challenges. It doesn't. It all depends on what you're looking for in your park jet. Not necessarily, you know, one is better than the other. Again, it would be better depending on what you want. So anyway, that's kind of what I wanted to go through here today. So, so just some general things. I'll just start off sort of with some general things first, and then talk about the flying that I've seen thus far. So, starting off with mid-mount, you know, let's even consider that this is a score and fold, you know, like a 3D type tube canopy or fuselage. They tend to be mid-mount tend to be simpler builds. You know, you have very little structure in the back here. Normally, you know, just a flat plate, control surfaces, vertical stabilizers. So they might be a better choice probably for beginners or those just getting started. In fact, I would say that they are. Because you have less foam, they tend to be lighter. They're also lighter because you normally don't have to run too many extra wires, servo extensions or extensions between your speed controller and your motor or your battery. So they do tend to be lighter, which again, if you're a beginner, is probably better. You're better to choose a park jet that's a little bit lighter. The crashes won't be as catastrophic and easier to fix. A little bit easier to lay out the components. You know, you don't have to do as much pre-planning when you're figuring out, you know, where to put your servos, your speed controller. Plus, you know, you normally have a fairly big electronics bay that, you know, you can move your speed controller, move your receiver around, you know, in conjunction with your battery to sort of get everything placed just right. Not as much critical planning. You can, you know, kind of build it and then figure out where everything goes once the airframe is together. It's easier to swap out components. So if you know, your ESC is acting up or your motor's going bad, you know, it's an easy swap out because, you know, everything's right there. You can swap out a motor in a couple of minutes, or you know, if need be, or, you know, if you want to experiment with a more powerful or less powerful setup, you can do that. Most designs, because your control surfaces, or two sets of your control surfaces, your elevons and your rudders, are in the prop wash. Normally, prop and slot airplane, most of them fly well just elevons only, or even just elevons rudder tends to be another good upgrade if you want to have you know, good control basically in all three axes. Disadvantage, obviously, not very scale looking. You've got just a flat plate normally in the back here. You know, some sort of hole right in the middle of your airplane. So for some that can be a bit of a disadvantage. So or you know, a reason that they might not want to build prop and slot. Okay, excuse me. A tail mount, a more complex build normally, you know, because you've got normally a full body, a full fuselage, you know, for the very scale looks. Heavier because you just normally have more parts, more structure. So that's, you know, something that you have to consider. It does take a bit more planning. I found with my F-18 it takes a bit more planning. You know, where to lay out, you know, put your servos, your speed controller, your receiver, and then, you know, figuring out how much extension wire that you might need for your servos, for your power system, you know, between your motor and speed controller, or between your speed controller and your battery. So you have to do a little bit more dry fitting and experimenting, because, you know, once you sort of button up the bottom of the plane and your components are where they are, it's difficult to modify that. You either have to you know, cut the plane open, which I suppose if you do nice and cleanly you can do that, move things around, and then glue that piece back on. But you know, you're sort of locked in a little bit more with where your components go, so that you can get the plane to balance. Difficult to swap out the components for the same reason. So you know, if you were building a tail mount park jet, I would suggest you know, don't put your oldest most beat up motor and speed controller and battery or receiver, that sort of stuff. I mean, not that I think you have to go out and buy anything brand new, but make sure you're going to put something in there that's good and reliable, and you're not going to have any issues with that. You know, you're going to have to cut the plane up open because you know, you've got issues with your motor or your speed controller or whatever. So just be a little bit more cognizant there. I haven't tried to fly my F-18 with elevons only, but I would suggest that elevons only might be a bit more difficult with a tail mount airplane. I would say probably from what I saw, elevons and ailerons probably would be a good choice, because then you've got lots of authority, a lot more authority in the roll and the pitch. You know, you could slave them, have a 2x4 setup where you have two control surfaces working off the same servo, or 4x4. I think if you're going to build you know, a beautiful scale looking plane, this is just, again, my opinion is, you know, go with all the controls, rudders, everything else, so you can, you know, play around with doing those more advanced type setups. So and obviously their biggest, I think one of their biggest advantages, they can be very scale looking. Like I'm just super impressed with how my FRC Foamies F-18 Hornet looks in the air. Like, it just really looks beautifully scale, you know, compared to other F-18s that I've flown. So really impressed with that. Okay, so let's talk a bit about flying. So normally in a prop and slot plane, depending, you know, as long as you don't go crazy and try and launch it at 100%, excuse me, torque roll is not going to be normally quite as much of a problem, because your source of torque roll is right about here, and you've got these sort of these big wings acting like outriggers to keep it from rolling too hard. That's not saying that you're never going to have torque roll with a prop and slot, but my experience, I've seen far less torque roll than in my tail mount. Slightly better control at slower speeds, because you do have some control surface in the prop wash. So, you know, even when the airplane is moving slow through the air, you do have you know, quite a bit more airflow going over the elevons and or the rudders. In a tail mount, you know, all your prop wash is behind your control surfaces, so the only airflow you've got going over your control surfaces is basically essentially the airspeed of the plane. You know, with a prop and slot, you can sort of cheat a little bit, because you have airflow going over the control surfaces even when the plane is moving slow through the air. You can have, it's easy to tighten things up when you build it, tighten things up or right around the control, the center of gravity, and still have the airplane balance easily, servo, speed controller, battery, that sort of thing, close to your motor. So you can do that, making it very easy to move in all three axes and giving the plane potentially a little bit better balance. Again, like going back, many of them fly quite easily with just elevons only. So if you're just a beginner, or you're just getting started off, you don't have a lot of servos, or you don't want to go with too complex a setup, you can fly them fairly easily, most of them with just elevons only, and get out there and fly and build up some experience and some skill and have a good time, and then move forward from there. One disadvantage that I have noticed, and this especially bit me a lot when I was a beginner, depending on how much throw you put on your elevons, you do have to be careful. One thing that can bite you at slow speed is, if you start to get into trouble and you get excited and yank back on the stick and your elevons, are deflected quite far, they can essentially just sit there and act like air brakes and cause the plane to essentially just stop in the air. And the unfortunate thing then is, if you're already a bit panicked, when you apply power, if you don't let off on the elevator, the up input of your elevons, it makes the thing even worse. It will stall even more, or it'll eventually get to the point where your plane will suddenly do quite a drastic flip. And if you're close to running into something like the ground or a tree or a fence or yourself, you're not going to have a lot of control over the plane. So that's something that you have to be very careful of, to get your throws set up just right, and realize that you can stall your plane, have like an elevon stall with your plane quite easily if you're not cognizant of that. So they are noisier. This foam being behind the prop doesn't really matter. I actually make my prop slots pretty big because I like to have lots of space in there, and it's still right away much noisier because this foam in the back here, it just amplifies the noise coming off of the prop, so it's going to be a lot noisier. The other thing that I have noticed is that they aren't quite as efficient a mid-mount because of that. Normally, I'm flying, compared to my tail mount F-18, when I'm flying around just, cruising around, I'm with a prop and slot, most of them I'm at around 60% throttle, and that's an airplane that's sort of the same size, maybe even lighter, and the same lighter weight than my F-18, whereas with my F-18 I'm pretty much comfortably cruising at around 50% throttle. So yeah, a little bit less efficient as a result. That's something there. For some people, again, just seeing that big hole in the middle of the plane is not really aesthetically pleasing. I've flown so many flights, I don't really pay much attention to it, but people do point out to me a lot, that it really doesn't look that great, but whatever, they're entitled to their opinion. I'm having fun, that's what matters. Okay, on a tail mount, torque roll, because your origin of torque is in the back here, and there's really nothing to slow it down. Torque roll is, I've seen torque roll in every launch that I've had with my F-18. Now there are certain things that you can do to mitigate it. I have put in my F-18. I have put in a little bit of right rudder to help with that. Also, sometimes launching it at a bit of a right bank angle tends to slow it down a little bit so that I can get some throttle on, get the plane under control. But what you do have to be careful of is there's kind of a delicate balance. If you don't give it enough throttle because you're scared of torque roll, and launch it, you toss it, and it's just not getting enough oomph to get moving forward and get some airflow going over the wings and the control surfaces. So, and then if you launch it with too much, your torque roll is going to be really aggressive and apparent, and then you could be, as soon as you let go of the plane, you're trying to get your hand back on the on the transmitter, and you're fighting this drastic torque roll. So it takes a little bit of practice. Like I've mentioned, on my F18, I'm flying with it's about a 1-to-1 thrust to weight ratio when I go to 50% throttle. You know, I have watched videos where you do have to be a bit more careful in your choice of power. You know, if you have a situation where, you know, at full throttle you're 1-to-1 thrust to weight ratio, that might be a bit more difficult with a tail mount, because now you've got, you know, maximum torque and just trying to get the airplane. So, you know, don't go the other way and put a big honking, you know, V8 size motor on the back either, because that's you know, that's not going to help, because that's also going to cause you a lot of torque. So anyway, I'm not trying to scare you, but it's definitely something that I've seen that's there. You just need to be prepared to handle it. Speed and throttle management is a bit more critical. You know, when you're going into turns, things like that, you know, you do have to carry a bit more speed, because, you know, as you go into a turn, naturally with any plane, you are going to lose a little bit of momentum, and as you lose momentum and lose airspeed on a tail mount, your control surfaces are, you know, they're not benefiting from the extra airflow over them like you have with a mid mount. So you do have to be a little bit more careful there. But I have found, like I've said, I'm just flying around mostly at about 50% throttle. That gives me plenty of control authority, and I can, you know, I can just fly around and go from one turn to the next, and it's not too much of a problem. The other thing, especially I find in the pitch, I do need to be anticipate a little bit more. You know, if I've gone into a loop, let's say, and the plane is kind of slow and it's coming down the backside of the loop, I normally have to start easily feeding in the pitch input a little bit earlier and a bit more gradually than I would with a prop and slot. Just as, you know, as the airplane is accelerating and the control surfaces are starting to get more authority, you know, I want to start feeding that in a little bit earlier and not sort of wait till the last minute and crank it. But that's just my flying style, but that's something that I've noticed. Slow speed stall maneuvers can be a little bit more tricky. Like sometimes, you know, I like to go up, you know, I'll pull my plane up and I'll kind of be, you know, in that slow speed stall, and then just, you know, maybe slowly pulling over the top, and you know, like you watch different airplanes do in air shows. One thing that I've noticed is you have to be a bit more critical on the power. With a lot of prop and slot airplanes, you know, I can pull up and do that, and as I'm sort of at the top, I can actually literally chop the power. The prop is going to continue to spin and give me a little bit of airflow still going over the control surfaces. With a prop and slot or with a tail mount, if I do that same thing and I pull up and I chop the power, now the plane will quite easily stall, and then sometimes it'll do like a funky maneuver on me. So it's best to just keep a little bit of power fed in there, and you just have to play around with it. The other thing I have noticed, it's kind of a double-edged sword. I'll talk about if I do pull up into a completely vertical stall. You know, on my F18, my battery is way up here, and most of my other heavier components are back here. So there's a pretty long sort of moment there. So what I've seen when I do a vertical stall is the plane always falls forward, but then what happens is, because I've got basically essentially a third of the airplane's weight right up here in the nose, is that it will swing down through, pitch down through violently, and then the momentum of that weight in the nose will actually carry it. So sometimes I'll almost end up on its back. So just something to be cognizant of. You know, if you're just flying your very first tail mount, is, you know, take it up good and high, you know, 100 feet or more, and just see how it's going to behave when you stall, so that if you do get in a situation, you know, where you might be getting a little slow and a little bit behind the power curve, you're going to kind of have an idea of what it's going to do, so you can, you know, you can start to feed some power in and maybe avoid that. So again, much quieter. I'm actually going to try and see. I have a little sound meter app on my phone, so the next time I go flying, I'm going to see if I can collect some sort of sound data on my F18. But I would say I don't know if it's half as quiet, but it's probably less than 3/4 as quiet. It's very, very quiet compared to a prop and slot. So that's, that's really nice that way, especially if, if you're flying where noise is a bit more of a concern, to keep your neighbors happy or the public happy. And I've already mentioned this before, very, very scale looking in the air. Now, one thing that I have found, and this was one of my paradigms about tail mount airplanes, is at least with my FRC Foamies F-18 anyway, I don't find it flies, once I sort of got it trimmed in, balanced, I actually find that I'm using essentially pretty much the same control surface deflection as I use with most of my mid-mount planes, and it just maneuvers very, very crisply and very, very easily. I was under the paradigm or the prejudice, I guess, because I hadn't flown one, that I was going to have to carry a whole lot of control surface deflection, and the plane, my F-18 has proven me wrong. So it doesn't feel, I don't feel like it's super nose heavy because the battery is so much further forward compared to most of my mid-mount park jets. So that's something, again, to the paradigm that I broke out of, so anyway, so there you go. Those are kind of my thoughts. Again, like I said, a lot of this stuff is just straightforward common sense. It's not anything that I thought of, but I wanted to give you my thoughts and observation on my experience with the build and the flying. I love how my F-18 looks. I'm not, going to jump and build all my planes now tail mount. I am going to build, I have the plans printed out, and I'm already starting to think about, I'm going to build the FRC Foamies F-22 because I have a soft spot in my heart for the F-22, so I'm gonna build that. But for simple builds, tough to go wrong with a prop and slot. Again, noisier, not quite as efficient, but lots of available designs around. So there we go, folks. I'm going to link my playlist for the FRC Foamies F-18 down below in the comments, and you can go watch that. I did a very detailed walk around, which had some of my challenges that I found during the build and maybe also during flying. So if you've never flown a tail mount park jet before, you can get some more idea there. I would encourage you just to try one at some point in time. That once you get them going and flying, there's those subtle differences that I mentioned, but they sure look cool. So if you want to have that one really super cool scale looking plane, when you go to the field to impress your buddies or your family and friends, certainly give one a try. So please, if you have any comments or questions, please leave those below. Thank you very much for watching. Blue skies, calm winds to everyone. Park jet noise. Yeah, the sound of freedom, baby. Take care.